Hello, this is C.L. Barber. Today we're going to be looking at Henry VIII and the fall of Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn had spent many years at the Austrian and French courts, so when she returned to England she was considered exotic. She was the lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon. Initially she rejected Henry VIII's advances, knowing that when someone became Henry's mistress, their chances of securing a good marriage afterwards was non-existent. Henry, however, pursued her, and from 1527 he started officially trying to gain the annulment. It took 6 years, and the attempt see the downfall of Cardinal Wolsey and the failure of Suffolk and her uncle the Duke of Norfolk. However, by 1533 Anne was pregnant, so an annulment was important. It was crucial that the child was born in wedlock. The new archbishop, who was appointed in 1532, Thomas Cranmer, married them in secret. Soon after that, the Act of Restraint of Appeals was passed. Within England and Empire, no one could now appeal to the Pope. Cranmer then declared the marriage between Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon invalid. This meant that Henry's marriage to Anne was now valid, and their child would be legitimate. In September, Princess Elizabeth was born. 3 years later, on the 7th of January 1536, Catherine of Aragon died, Henry and Anne dressed in yellow, which is hardly the colour of mourning. Later that month, Henry fell from his horse whilst jousting. He was unconscious for several hours and suffered permanent leg damage. On the 29th of January, the day of Catherine's funeral, Anne miscarried. She claimed it had been brought on by the shock of Henry's accident. 4 months later, she was accused of adultery with 5 men and sentenced to death. So why did their marriage last only around 1,000 days? By 1536, Henry had turned 45, which in the Tudor times was the beginning of old age, and he still didn't have a son. The fall earlier in the year from his horse had scarred him, and it had made him worry about dying with no son to inherit. Due to his break from Rome also, the Pope had written a papal bull, saying that England would be given to anyone who could take it. Henry was worried about an invasion from France or from Spain. As with Catherine, he thought his lack of a son with Anne was due to God's disapproval of the marriage. Henry's visit to Anne shortly after her 1536 miscarriage showed how his feelings had changed. The Spanish ambassador reported that Henry's response was, "I see that God will not give me male children." Some believe that in 1536 Anne actually gave birth to a deformed baby. If true, this would have made Henry even more convinced that God was unhappy with him. It might also have led him to believe that Anne was a witch, although there is no hard evidence to support this theory. By 1536, Anne was annoying Henry in other ways as well. She had a quick, sharp mind, which had won him over initially as they contrasted with the obedient attitude of Catherine. However, he started to find her feistiness irritating. She was different from her lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, who was sweet, calm and obedient. Henry decided that he needed to be rid of Anne Boleyn so that he could replace her with Jane, who would be a more subservient and supportive wife. Also, as Jane came from a family where there had been 10 children, Henry considered that perhaps she might be able to give him a son. Also, by 1536, the atmosphere at court was poisonous. We don't know where it started, but at this time there was a rumour that Anne was being unfaithful to Henry. If Anne had provided a son for Henry, then maybe he wouldn't have listened to the rumours. However, it suited Henry to take it seriously, and so on the 24th of April, Henry asked Cromwell to investigate. This suited Cromwell, who didn't like Anne, and he may have even had a hand in encouraging Henry to believe the rumours. On the 30th of April, Mark Smeaton, a musician at court, was arrested. He was probably tortured under Cromwell's command and eventually confessed to an affair with the Queen. Others were then arrested and a case was put together, with Anne eventually accused of 5 cases of adultery and treason. This included her brother George, although it is unlikely that any of them were true. Finally, Anne was accused of adultery with 5 people. Mark Smeaton, a 23-year-old musician, Sir Francis Weston, a 25-year-old friend of Henry and a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, Sir Henry Norris, a 54-year-old long-term friend of Henry and groom of the stall. Sir William Brereton, a 48-year-old gentleman of the Privy Chamber. Her own brother George, 32 years old and a member of the Privy Council. Some weren't even with Anne in the same locality at the time, but they were enemies of Cromwell, and some historians say he was determined to use this as an opportunity to get rid of political rivals as well as Anne, whom he disliked and feared. So was there any truth? Well, although Anne was a flirt, and she enjoyed male company, it's highly unlikely that she ever cheated on Henry. Except for Mark, who was the only one who was tortured, the others all denied the charges, as their noble status meant that they couldn't be tortured. This means that their claims are likely to be more reliable than Smeaton's. However, it didn't really matter if Anne was guilty or not. It only really mattered that Henry wanted her dead. So what was the role of Cromwell? Well, Cromwell was undeniably crucial in Anne's downfall. Henry ordered Cromwell to look at whether her former relationship with Henry Percy, son of the Earl of Northumberland, was meant that their marriage wasn't valid. Rumours stated that Anne and Percy had secretly been engaged, but Cromwell could find no evidence. Cromwell built a case against Anne, personally interrogating Mark Smeaton and collecting evidence against the others. This was mainly based on conversations people supposedly overheard, so mainly Anne was convicted around court gossip. He had ensured that all those who served Anne were spies and reported everything to him. That included her sister-in-law, who informed on George Boleyn, her own husband. Although Cromwell collected the evidence, some historians wonder if his role was actually much larger, and if her fall was due to a plot by Cromwell. Some believe Cromwell more than Henry wanted Anne to fall from power due to their different views on how money from the dissolution of the monastery should be spent, as well as their different opinions on foreign policy. Anne thought the money should be used to fund charities and schools, whilst Cromwell wanted to make Henry richer. Cromwell also wanted an alliance with Charles, whilst Anne wanted to be allied with the French. Cromwell knew Anne was a dangerous enemy, as she had helped bring about the downfall of Wolsey, and Cromwell didn't want to meet the same fate. There is evidence that Cromwell resorted to plotting as he spoke to Henry of Anne's alleged affairs, knowing it might well lead to her downfall. So some think that Cromwell clearly manipulated Henry. However, others think that Henry wanted Cromwell to find evidence so that he could get rid of her and have a son with Jane Seymour. So if we're going to summarise what the reasons for Anne's downfall were, and to put them into an essay, we would say firstly that Henry had fallen in love with Jane Seymour, another lady at court, who was calm, sweet, obedient, and likely to give him a son. We would say the role of Thomas Cromwell, who was the one that gathered evidence against her for adultery, and also some believe plotted against her deliberately to bring her down. Most important probably of all is the fact that Henry believed that Anne could not give him a son, and therefore God was displeased with the marriage. Perhaps if Anne had been able to give him a son in that 3 years, and hadn't had the miscarriages, then Henry would have kept their marriage alive. And as a result of these, Anne was accused of adultery with 5 people, including her brother. So, when you are revising, you need to think of summary, failure to produce a male heir, the role of Cromwell, Anne's personality and suspected adultery, and Henry falling for Jane Seymour. You need to think about which of these was most important, how they link together. This is C.L. Barber, 1977. Thank you for watching.